I read 94 books in 2024. Here are the 5-star reads. Hello, welcome back to Recovering Book Snob. My name is Chloe. It's been a while and I've missed you. And I'm sorry for being away so long. 2024 was a year of exploring new genres, picking up books that I never thought I would like. That's what I aim to do every year, but more and more I'm getting braver and I'm reading slightly more random ones, and I'm excited to say that a lot of those made it onto this list. Also, I've just noticed if you see my flannel pajama top poking through my jumper, no you didn't. Without further ado, and oh, in no particular order, Mongrel. This is the story of 3 Japanese women, Mei, Yuki and Haruka, living very different lives, living in very different places, but with this strong sort of theme of identity and loneliness and love. Read a little bit about it before you get into it, just so you know you're ready for some of the themes. I actually picked this up at the library. Usually I'm quite organised with my reading, but this was one of the few books that I kind of just randomly picked up. I don't think it was on my radar at all before I found this book. So it was a really pleasant surprise. I mean, the book is devastating, like it's really gut-wrenching, but it's extremely poetic. It's a very easy, the language is very clear and easy to read, but there's this like rhythm to it that feels like you're reading a poem, and makes it like you could just gobble up the lines. Beautiful, emotive, but definitely accessible language. Demon Copperhead. I know that this has been hyped all over the place, but this was another 5-star read of mine. This is a modern retelling of David Copperhead, and it's about a boy who is born into pretty terrible circumstances, very poor, in a lot of ways a very challenging early life. And we follow him as he grows up, I guess. It's a pretty chunky book. It's also set against the backdrop of the opioid crisis. We'll get onto it, but I also read a non-fiction, a very chunky non-fiction, about opioids in America. So that for me was a very big part of the book. But our main character, Damon, had me so emotional. By the time I got to the end of the book, I haven't been attached to a character like that in such a long time. I now have since I read that book, but I remember at the time reading it and just, you know, when you finish a story and there's just so much adrenaline coursing through your veins because there's this feeling of like grief for the character that you're gonna leave behind when you know, turn that final page. So I really had that with this book. And the story is also, it's kind of predictable, I thought, but if anything that made me enjoy it more. You didn't have these like dramas and twists and turns thrown in there just to spice it up. Either or. This is the sequel to The Idiot by Elif Batuman, and it's The Idiot, but like the idiot's cool older sister, cool, more mature older sister, in a very like great intentional way. So Either Or starts where we left off with The Idiot, and our main character, Selin, is very self-absorbed. A lot of her kind of thoughts and anxieties are just quite typical of, you know, someone of that age, of kind of like a similar age to me. Well, depends what you mean by similar. But also she is just very endearing and it really tugs at the heartstrings, and I personally, unfortunately or fortunately as the case may be, found it quite relatable in parts, and I don't know, it felt like a really good sequel because it was the same, it had the same slow meandering, very comforting feeling, like a bit of a hug, a bit of a slightly confusing hug, but you saw a lot of character development, and I also think it was quite unexpected. The Rachel Incident. This is a book about a student named Rachel working in a bookshop in Cork, and she very early in the book meets her BFFF, James. They move in together. They are both pretty chaotic, pretty reckless, and this is definitely one of those like frazzled chaotic woman in her 20s and 30s type books, but I do think that this one's just better. Like, it just, for me, it just stands apart from the rest. It's one of the first times I've really felt I've enjoyed the humour. Like, I've really thought the humour was very clever and funny. It's very silly, but also so moving and like so sincere. Empire of Pain, this is one of the non-fics that I read this year, and I cannot stop recommending this book. I'm really, really, really in awe of it. It is so well researched. It's about the Sackler family and America's opioid crisis and the role that the Sackler family had in this crisis. But as I said, just so much kind of research must have gone into this book, and it kind of focuses on the people, the Sacklers as individuals, as well as opioids and the company at large, and all of the kind of lawsuits and all the details around that, but also the individuals and the personalities. I could not put this book down. It was so interesting, also quite shocking, terrifying. It's definitely on, I don't have this list, it doesn't exist yet, but maybe I need to start it. It's on my kind of books to read before you die. Pachinko. This is multi-generational, extremely chunky, about a Korean family who moves to Japan. It does follow 4 generations, I think. There were times when I felt like it was maybe spread a little thin. On the other hand, each character just had such clear purpose. I also thought what was really cool is that with each new generation, you kind of got a better understanding of the generations that came before. So it really felt like, although you were reading about, you know, X person's story, that story then was making you kind of rethink and like reprocess the stories that you'd just read about earlier, which I don't know if I've really had that before, to that extent at least. The plot was great, the pacing was great, an extremely good book. Killers of the Flower Moon. I read this because I wanted to watch the film, but someone told me it wasn't worth it. So I read the book to fill that void. This is a historical true crime. It's about the founding of the FBI, but it's also, and most of all, about the killing of very wealthy Osage Native Americans. I had proper kind of shivers down my spine when reading this book. It's such an interesting, horrifying story, and again, just really well researched, but still red light fiction. And wow. My Brilliant Friend. I read the whole 4-book series that is My Brilliant Friend. So that's My Brilliant Friend is the first book, Story of a New Name, Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay, and The Story of a Lost Child. And I gave all of them 5 stars. Interestingly, My Brilliant Friend, I think I sort of initially gave it 4, or initially gave it kind of a 4.5, and then I ended up upgrading it because I couldn't stop thinking about it. These books are all very distinct. I'm going to talk about them together because, well, they are a collective. But do not be fooled. They're very, very distinct, and maybe I need to do a whole video on them where we break down the series. I find it pretty difficult to speak about this story. It feels like it changed my life. I don't even know how. I can't really explain it. So it's this 4-part series following 2 friends, Elena and Lila, as they just live, as they grow up. It follows them until, honestly, they're in their 50s, I think. Like, it's their whole lives that we're looking at. They grow up in post-war Naples. It comes in the later books more, but there's also a really strong commentary on like the political landscape at the time. Both of the characters are just such brilliant female characters because they're so unappealing. And they just are, it's like representation for crude, rude, selfish women, you know, but they're also doing their best with the tools they've been given. What an incredible series. It just really surprised me. I remember hearing loads about My Brilliant Friend and hearing that it was, you know, about like female friendship and growing up and all this stuff, and I think when you hear those things you have a certain like view of what you think the book will be about and what you think the characters will be like, and usually that suspicion is validated and you're like, oh yeah, it's a good book, but you're not surprised. But My Brilliant Friend just it surprised me. And then reading the later books, like with each new book, as you see them develop, like I was still somehow surprised. Character development is just, it's insane. And you also end up so in the community, and like you get introduced to all these characters, and at points it feels a little bit concerning because you're like, oh no, are we going to meet so many people who are never fully filled out, who don't really offer that much, but each of them ends up being so important. And then you're also left with this overall just such a rich picture of the community that they kind of grow up in. On my holiday to Italy that I went on, I saved the final book to read on holiday, and that was a magical experience. The Goldfinch, I won't keep you long on this one. If you look it up, and I found this before I read it, it's very hard to understand what the book's about. The way Google describes it is it's about a young boy named Theo who survives a terrorist attack in a museum, and that leads him into a life of crime. And that's kind of it. And I initially, before I read the book, I was kind of grumpy because I was like, why am I being given no real description? Like, I don't really understand how you can convince me to read 600 pages. I think it's 600. You're giving me so little to grab onto. I don't know why, but I finished it and I was like, this is just, it's got that raw magnetism that you don't find in books very often. I love Theo. I love how original it felt. I just feel like a very strong feelings towards this book, positive feelings, and I can't ignore them and I can't explain them, but I think you ought to read The Goldfinch, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. Buried in the Sky. This is another non-fiction read and I loved it. I loved it so much. It's a slightly random one because I'm not into climbing. I was given it by a friend and she also had just heard good things, but she hadn't read it, so she was like, a bit of a risk, but give it a go, let me know. This book is about the 2008 K2 disaster where just loads of people died. A very abnormal number of people died. It tells you kind of the timelines and you get this incredible amount of detail, especially considering that so many people died and there is so much opportunity for information to be lost. So you get this really tense timeline story where you're just learning hour by hour about all these things that are happening. But the story is given from the perspective of the Sherpas, who kind of help these climbers up the mountain, and the communities that they come from and their relationship with the mountains, their relationships with the climbers who pay them to take these huge risks. And it also looks at the power dynamic and then like how that relates to some of the stuff that happened in 2008 on K2. I was in awe of how you cobble together a story like that, how you understand these events and then turn it into something that people want to read. But there were also a lot of little nuggets that made you think about the ethics of high altitude mountaineering and also just the motivations. I think, as I said, I'm not into climbing, so it was really interesting dipping my toe in that world and thinking for the first time about why these people do these things. And obviously there was a lot of criticism, but it still felt like the book was very empathetic to all parties. The Blind Assassin. This is a Margaret Atwood, and I've been really tearing through Margaret Atwood recently. I feel similarly about it to how I feel about The Goldfinch, in that it's quite hard to describe the story. The Blind Assassin is even harder to describe the story because it's got a bit of a novel within a novel going on that is not explained, which I guess it's not meant to be explained. Like, I'm meant to just get it, I'm meant to just be a good reader and understand these things immediately, but sometimes you don't. Nonetheless, you spend a lot of the book, or I spent a lot of the book, just kind of reading, trusting the process. But I think I got to like a third of the way through or halfway through, and I was just like, why am I starting to feel just all of the emotions ever? And you get to the end and you close it and you're like, okay, so now I'm crying, and I still couldn't really tell you why. It kind of focuses on two sisters and the mysteries of one of their lives. It's a little bit confusing at times, but very rewarding in the end. My first Stephen King, The Stand. This is terrifying. It is about a global pandemic that wipes out 98% of humanity, and that kind of leads to a battle between good and evil. The first half of the book is about the spreading of the virus, and then it's more the second half where you start to get more of this like good and evil going on. The tone actually changes quite a lot. It does feel like it could be two separate books. The spreading of the virus, those sections, I cannot, like, it was so chilling. I was reading it and I was like, okay, I understand why everyone's obsessed with Stephen King. Like, just riveting and scary and just like, oh, it's just so vivid. You really do feel like you're in it. Oh, yeah. I don't think I've ever had such a visceral response to a book. And I did really like the second half as well, but I think the first half is what kind of earned this book a 5 stars. Kitchen. This is a pretty small book. It's about a young Japanese woman. Her grandmother dies and she's trying to deal with that, and she slowly makes a new friend, and we kind of learn more then about the friend's story. It's just very beautiful. It's a translation. The language is very simple. It's set in a city, so you have these really mundane urban city environments that are somehow turned into these incredible places. Just a really beautiful one about grief and love and boring life, except maybe it's not so boring. I Who Have Never Known Men. This one's pretty crazy. It's a dystopian novel about a woman. The start of our book is her in this weird bunker with no memory of what happened before, surrounded by a group of loads of women, and her and the other woman are imprisoned, and you have these man guards guarding them, and it goes from there. This one is another quite short one, but I don't think I've ever read a book so fast. I blitzed through it. It's made me want to become fluent in French, because I think reading this book in its original language would be a crazy experience. It's original and very weird. The tone of voice is also like pretty memorable. Reading it felt pretty timeless. I don't think I realised it was a bit older. I assumed it was published like in the last few years. It is very depressing, but I kind of liked that. I think that was necessary to make me think and make me learn. This one's probably going to haunt me forever, so if you don't want to be haunted forever by this very strange book, then maybe don't read it, because that is what you're signing up for. But I also think you really should read it. Okay guys, we're done. It's over. I hope to see you soon, sooner than usual. I'm sorry I've been very absent. I can't explain it. I just get scared. I get in these ruts and I get scared of making videos for no reason. Thanks for being here. Let me know what you want next, and let me know how your 2025s are going so far. Maybe I need to update you on how my 2025 is going so far. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.